So it's really, really good to be back with you. I hope you've had an enjoyable lunch/dinner wherever you are. And we're here now, extraordinary evangelization in extraordinary times. Lots of the things that we've been talking about, some of the knowledge, the skills, and then soon to come the attitudes, are very, very general. They're kind of applicable in pandemic and non-pandemic times. I'm really delighted to get some people who I am blessed to call, really close friends and people who I love and admire, to have a conversation and allow people as part of the conference to eavesdrop on a conversation about evangelization in the time that we're finding ourselves, because of course it's not just about the content, but the context matters when it comes to evangelization. And one of the things I've found about the pandemic, and we'll get into this with our speakers, we'll have a chance to for people to introduce each other and then to have some real talks about about some of the kind of issues. So do collaborate in the chat with us as well. But well, actually, then let's do the introductions now. We'll start with that. So let's start with David. So David, a very, very close friend, and David, why don't you kick us off by what does sharing the church's story look like in your life by way of introducing yourself?
Oh my goodness! Ouch! Okay, I see myself as a catechist, really. I'm very privileged. I get invited all over the world. That sounds, I did before the pandemic, by the way. Now I don't get invited out of my house, really. But I would say that for me, I have been a catechist at heart, trying to relate the everyday events of life with the truth of the gospel, and trying to really fascinated by the relationship between what happens to us and our encounters and our life experience and this text, which we call the word of God. And that the connection of that is where I think Christianity gets really exciting. So that's my story.
Amazing, thank you. Let's go then next to Georgia. We have Georgia on the panel, who's one of the coordinators of Catholic Voice. So by way of introduction, what does sharing the church's story look like for you?
Thanks, Brenden, and hi to everyone. Really a privilege to be on this panel with such fantastic people. So I'm the coordinator of the public speaking program for Catholic Voices, which is really a privilege because the way I share the church's story is via others. We have a pool of fantastic speakers, so I get to help train them up, send them into the relevant parish or school or university to share what they're passionate about, whatever it is about the church that they love and they want to talk about. So that's one of my roles. And then in another role, I am a youth worker, young adult worker in a parish here in London. So I do a bit of evangelization as also on the ground.
Going to go to Andre next, but you've been pipped by a cleric who has slipped into the panel now. So Monsignor John Armitage, Master of the Guild of Our Lady of Ransom and parish priest in Canning Town, former rector of the National Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham in Norfolk. Father John, if you just want to introduce yourself and also address the question of what does sharing the church's story, which is the theme of our conference today, what does that look like for you?
Well, thank you. I think you've done a very good introduction, but I would introduce myself basically as a parish priest. I've done lots of jobs in my life as a priest, but it's always been as a parish priest because to me, that's the heart of the church. It's our communities. What you call them really doesn't matter, but it is the parish, it is the geographical presence of the Christian community in people's lives that seems to me the most important element of the work of the church. We can do all sorts of other things, but unless we recognize the sense of belonging that comes through being part of a Christian community, whatever that shape may look like, and the parish for most people is going to be the primary connection because within the parish, it's where the sacraments are celebrated. And the sacraments are our connections of our life and our faith. And so whatever other jobs I've done, and I've had a few in my time, it's been essentially as a parish priest. I've just, after 6 years in Walsingham, arrived back in the parish, and people said to me, "Father, what's your plan?" And I said, "I haven't got one." And they said, "You must have a plan." I said, "No, I haven't got a plan at all." I said, "There are 3 priorities, and the first is prayer, because prayer changes me, it doesn't change God. Secondly, the truth, because it sets us free. And thirdly, the radical generosity as a community." So there would be 3 priorities. And I think the consequence of that, when you see it in the Christian community, is evangelization. So evangelization, as far as I can see, is a consequence. It's not a particular program.
I love that. A fantastic introduction that there already is kind of teasing us with what our conversation is going to kind of dive into. So thank you so much, Father John. And then finally, on our illustrious panel, we have Andre Renier zooming in from, or not zooming in. We have not been sponsored to say that. Is streaming in from Canada, who is one of the co-founders of CCO, Catholic Christian Outreach in Canada. So please introduce yourself, Andre, and what does sharing the church's story look like for you?
Well, thank you very much. I am a Canadian, the lone Canadian here. It's a real privilege to be with you guys. Fundamentally, I would say that I am an evangelist. I felt God had called me 32 years ago to start a movement of evangelization. And the motivation behind that was a recognition that most of our people, especially on university campuses, were walking away very easily. Nobody was fighting for them to come back. We're just assuming that they'll come back eventually. But we felt that we need to be proactive in going after them. And so going after them was not just inviting them back to church, which by the way, Father, I totally agree with you. But not just inviting them back to the parish, but inviting them into a personal relationship about their relationship with God, their prayer life, the truth that you're talking about, Father, and the community. And so, that's a little bit of who I am. I am a father of 5 children and 6 grandchildren.
Marvelous. So yeah, as I've said before, please do be active in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from, what you found inspiring and insightful and challenging about the conference thus far. And if there are particular quotes or particular ideas and concepts that are shared in the panel, do kind of make those known, because it's really, really good to just kind of have live feedback. And we'll also have a chance for answering Q&A. So do pop in the chat or in the Q&A if you've got any kind of questions, thoughts, comments, reflections. So as we start this panel proper, the title being Extraordinary Evangelization in Extraordinary Times, we're really going to be thinking about some of the challenges and the opportunities presented by the pandemic. A very senior churchman in England, and I won't embarrass him by naming him. It's not Father John, by the way. A very senior churchman in England. I once was having a conversation with him, and he'd had an experience of different parts of the church in England. He'd been in the north, been in the south. And I asked him, I said, "What's your sense of the Catholic community in England and Wales? What's your reading of the pulse of the church?" And he thought for a while, and he said, "The church is tired." And this was pre-pandemic. There's a fatigue, a sorrow, and I think it's good to acknowledge that as we kind of begin. And I really have a sense as I speak with people that we are living in a time of fear. Fear makes you do one of 2 things. You either approach or avoid, kind of go forward in confidence or withdraw. And the fear, in a sense, I guess, because fear is not a bad thing necessarily, But the fear is that in many quarters, Catholics lack the confidence, the competency to go forward in faith, to go forward in confidence. And so I really want to just kind of open up for discussion. How do we, as part of this conference where we're trying to equip people with the knowledge, the skills and the understanding to have that confidence to share the church's story, I want to just get some insights from our panel to start a discussion really about what that looks like, in the context of the pandemic and the post-pandemic church, to think, what does the next 5-10 years look like, and how do we prepare ourselves as Catholics? So maybe I just want to start with Monsignor John, because one of the things that has been part of the English picture of the pandemic is that before the pandemic, you were preparing the nation, so England and Wales, to be rededicated as the dowry of Mary, to Our Lady as the model disciple. And it's always interesting how Our Lady gives us a message, and the message was "Share my joy." This is the message of Walsingham. So I wonder if you could share with us maybe how Our Lady teaches us to be a better evangelist, and something of that, I guess, that dynamic as you were preparing the nation, or helping the nation to rededicate England as Our Lady's dowry, and then the pandemic happened. How has that kind of affected your ministry, and what has it made you think?
Well, Our Lady is the first disciple, and she's unique insofar as she was there for everything. She was there throughout the whole, from the conception of her son right the way through to Pentecost. And she was there with the church. It says those beautiful words. And, Mary was there. They were joined with Mary, the Mother of God. So right at the beginning, Mary is there as the first disciple. And there seem to me three moments. First is the Annunciation. The Annunciation is the message. And Mary was presented with the message, and she was afraid of it. She was troubled by what God was asking her to do. And I think today many of us are troubled by what we're faced with, because it looks so daunting. And like Mary, we can feel deeply concerned about what we're asked to do. Yet in the heart of the message of the Annunciation, which is the message that the Word became flesh and lived among us, is this promise: do not be afraid, because there is nothing impossible for God. So the first important guarantee almost of for someone who wishes to pass the message on, to evangelize, is despite your fears, despite your anxieties, okay, nothing is impossible for God. And don't be afraid. Now, the important thing is she goes from the Annunciation, she goes immediately. It says she quickly went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, and she went on visitation. She wanted to share. Her faith was there, of course. She wanted to share this good news with her cousin Elizabeth. And someone beat her to it. St. John the Baptist, who sort of jumped up and down in his mother's womb, and because of the presence of the Saviour, but she'd gone there. So the first thing was the message. She accepted the message. The second thing, she shared the message by going on a journey, and she never stopped. And the third thing was she recognized that the message was pure gift for her. That's why she said her Magnificat. Her Magnificat was, I rejoice in the God, my Saviour, because the Almighty has done great things for me. So it's God's gift, which can frighten us. But God's gift is possible. God never gives us something to do that's impossible. We then take it and share it. And we do that as a matter of urgency. It was quickly done. And then thirdly, we need to give thanks and recognize that this is what we have been given. So those three things in terms of a basis for foundation are in fact the three elements in the life of Our Lady. How we build on that then is up to us. The message will come to me personally. I need to then accept that for that message to be brought alive, I have to share it with somebody else. But then I always have to take it back and say thank you to God for what he has given to me. And just the last point I'd make is that I think we get confused with terms. And I think evangelization can be confusing. I'm not saying in itself it is, but it can be confusing because it presumes something that very often isn't there. You know, when we look at the great encyclical of Paul VI, Evangelii Nunciandi, he says before evangelization, there is the most key element, which is pre-evangelization. Pre-evangelization raises the question. Part of our problems is that we've got the answer to all the questions. But if nobody's asking the question, if nobody's actually asking, you know, what is salvation about? We can talk about Jesus and being saved and redeemed, but if you're not asking the question needs to come first. The method of Jesus in terms of his work was to ask questions. What are you looking for? What are you seeking? Why are you here? And so if we are looking as a key to the beginning to understand evangelization, we have to understand the basic human relationship where people ask themselves, why are you like this? Why is your community like that? Because it's from that question that people then seek answers. And I think that pre-evangelization, we need to really, really understand the consequence of that in the way that we. Thank you.
That's excellent. And I think that beautiful triptych of the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the Magnificat, I want to propose that and now use it to kind of bring in our other speakers, because no doubt that there'll be lots of kind of, you know, fireworks going off from things that Father John has said, and particularly like, I'll propose this, and of course we can have a more dynamic conversation. But perhaps, Andre, if you want to kind of initially focus on the Annunciation, so what is it about getting the message clear, which is so much of the work of CCO is really about, you know, clarity, you know, to be clear and simple about the message. Perhaps Georgia to speak after that about the sharing the story, because so much of kind of Catholic Voices is that impetus where we model ourselves on the Visitation, and then David on that kind of the spirit of joy and the gratitude that comes back from that, and you know, the kind of joy that ought to be a consequence of that encounter with the gospel. So I propose that as a kind of way of kind of building on what Father John has presented there, and any other thoughts that were coming to mind as he was speaking. So I don't know if you want to kind of kick us off with the message, Andre.
Well, something you said, Brenden, that I could see it in the message board that caught Tom's interest is, you know, the church is tired. And I agree that it looks tired and old and kind of, you know, it just lacks kind of zeal. You know, there's a saying, I think it really speaks to our tiredness, you know, or what we could do to get our zeal back. Maintenance, you know, if we just stay the same, we'll get tired because we get bored and kind of it's predictable. But new life always brings new people, bring new life into the community. So really conversion, people's conversion coming into the church will now be re-energized. So what brings conversion is the message itself. You know, I wrote a book on, you know, clear and simple, meaning the message, and the church is very clear that the message fundamentally in evangelization is about a person. You know, we like to kind of give everyone all the information of the church, doctrine and devotion, and people are overwhelmed. And by the way, doctrine and devotion is extremely important. But what is critical is the message itself, the relationship that Christianity invites. And that relationship is Christ. It's Christocentric. It's inviting people into that relationship that opens up the door, opens up the relationship with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But as a church, and I have lots of slides which I won't show right now, but what we're what we're seeing is that that we've complicated the message, but the church wants, especially Pope Francis, wants us to simplify the message. And we, as Catholics, have really good theology in regards to this, but we complicate it by way too complicated.
Don't know what happened to Andre just there. He just disappeared. And Father John has as well. Gosh, is the panel going this badly? So why don't we, just as they come back, we go into, oh, here we go. Andre and Father John are back.
Everything I said while I was gone was so profound and life transforming that I can't even say it anymore. So it's been said. Basically, do you want me to continue, Brenden?
Yeah. So I think what is happening is that we've just got to be careful not to press the red remove button next to people. So don't press the red button next to anyone's name, otherwise they get booted out of the meeting and have to come back in. So yeah, sorry, Andre, where you were and
Okay.
Georgia.
So I think we need to to simplify the message and focus it in on the person of Jesus and what the Annunciation brought to us. And it has 4 points. And one is the story of creation, meaning we were created to be in relationship with the Trinity. That was the reason we were created. But the second theological principle is the result of the fall. We have to talk about sin, but not sin as judgment, but sin as letting people know the reality, meaning we have all sinned, meaning none of us are perfect and we all know it. But that sin has consequences, which we all know is true. If I don't respect a relationship, we know instinctively as social beings that it has consequences. So we have to talk that sin, Adam and Eve's sin, original sin itself, has consequences in our relationship with God. So the fall actually has impacted us. But the third truth is the good news, which is Jesus, the incarnation. Jesus came to restore that relationship, to deal with the sin problem, to deal with the division between man and God. But the third principle is forget the term, but is we have to adhere to it. That we have to say yes to the gospel, to the message. It can't be just assumed. If we hear it, that's fine. But we always have to, we're invited to say yes in order for the message itself to have an impact on our spiritual life. That's, to me, the message that can be communicated in very simple terms that people can actually understand and then know how to respond to. The Annunciation. I can't hear you, Brenden.
Apologies, it's obviously getting that late in the conference, but we have a good, forgiving audience. Father John, he's coming in and out, so we'll just have to bear with that. Apologies. So we've heard a little bit about the need for the message to be clear and simple, but what about this next movement of sharing the church's story, that kind of image that we were given of the visitation, Georgia?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked me about the visitation because I love it so much. This image of two women coming together, they're models of femininity, of womanhood, of holiness, with Christ at the center of that relationship there. That was why they were there. That's why they were together. That she went with haste to her cousin probably to serve in some way, that she accepted through the Annunciation the Son of, and then she went to serve and to be with her cousin. And I think that message of service and sharing is probably at the heart of what communication is like for Catholic Voices. When we go to a parish, when we go into a school, it's how can I serve? How can I serve? How can I tell you what I've been given so that you can have the joy, or so that I can answer what I believe and why I have the hope that I have, which is what St. Peter encourages us to do. And then in her true humility, Mary saying, "My soul magnifies the Lord." And, you know, it's humility that is a true opinion of ourselves. So how do we as speakers, how do we go out when we share, have that true humility? What does our spirit actually rejoice in? So there is an element of reflection before we do go out and share the message, that we go out with humility and, yeah, Christ at the center of all things and service, I think, are the things that come to mind.
Thank you. And then David, something of the kind of gratitude, a kind of authentic response to the message and how it's been shared. What strikes you about that?
Oh my goodness. This is great to be part of. So look, I want to concur with Father John and Andre and Georgia. And I want to say, my experience, I don't like this. I don't fully understand it, but the church is tired. Lots of expression of the church is tired. Some of our meetings are boring. I mean, they are. And we're all kind of dutifully, stoically persevering. You know, I hear priests complaining about deanery meetings. I hear parishioners complaining about parish meetings. It's not terrible. We're not bad people. But actually, I think we've got to rethink this. We need to really do. The Magnificat is interesting, isn't it? Because it's an outpouring of joy and a plea for justice. And so my gut instinct is two things, really, that we see in this opportunity. The first is to listen to Pope Benedict when he says that the purpose of the church is to bring joy to the world. Hello? I mean, look, so I say to people, can we rethink our meetings? If they're joyless, they're not going to work. They're just not. And one of the clues there is anybody enjoying them? And if they're not going to work. And then another thing Pope Benedict taught us was that joy is vulnerable. Like, we start with a lot of joy in the Christian faith. You know, for many of us, as a young man, I was thrilled to encounter Christ and full of zeal, and you know, and then life happens, and we had children, and we had to get up 3 times a night, and we got tired, and then we got frustrated. So one of the things is, you know, I'd be really, really calling upon the church to pray for joy at Pentecost, the joy of Mary in the Magnificat. That's, you know, like, cheer up. And then, you know, this vision of joy is vulnerable. And to say to ourselves, you know, in what ways does David Wells need to recover his joy, as Mary does in the, you know, it just pours out of her. So I would be saying, what a lovely triptych, yes, and thank you, Father John, for giving us that if you like, that diagram for us to operate in. And I would be saying, probably, if I learned anything in the pandemic, it is that it is joy that we missed, actually.
Yeah.
So, Father John, I take it you can hear us again.
I can. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. My mistake.
Praise God. So I think, and David has nicely teed us into thinking about what's been on our hearts and minds during the pandemic. What are some of the challenges and opportunities? You know, we've got a quite good image, a diagram, a triptych, as has been spoken about, Our Lady teaching us, you know, those kind of key components of the message and sharing the message, and the joy and the gratitude that follows as a response. So what, from people's various vantage points, have they been finding are the real kind of challenges or opportunities as they reflect in the pandemic? I'm happy for anyone to kind of come first.
Can I just throw one out there? And it's ever so brief. I would love us to change our relationship with failure. All right, you know, like we get to meetings and we start beating ourselves up over things not working, and then we start blaming each other, and we talk about young people or parents or people who come to mass late, and it isn't long before we kind of, you know, it's all out there. One of the things is, you know, Pope Francis in Gaudete et Exsultate, talking very powerfully about holiness as the relationship between our failure and the grace of God. Where those two things meet is joy, because we receive love. You know, so I want to say I would like us to be more of a daring, experimental church that isn't afraid of things not working, that does as Andre proposed and said, let's try and look at things a bit differently and get together, you know, in the wisdom of the tradition of the church. You know, there's nothing new here. But then to say, you know, let's do something and treat failure with the humour that it deserves, and not be beaten up and depressed, you know, when people don't join us in their thousands.
And we're definitely modelling this in this conference. We don't mind failing.
I would want to suggest that one of the things I really struggled with in the preparation for the rededication of England was people would say, well, what does joy mean? Isn't it the same as happiness? And that reflects a sort of a, you know, happiness is very, very transitory. It's dependent on how you feel. You know, if West Ham are winning, I am incredibly happy. Right? For Andre, that's our local football team here, for your cultural connection there. All right. So if they're winning, I'm really happy. But happiness is just, you know, the difference between happiness and joy is the difference between a puddle and the deep sea. Puddles dry up very quickly. The deep sea is full of depth, and joy is something that is not dependent on whether my football team's winning, whether I've got a lot of money, whether I'm fabulously good looking or dressing well or successful. These are worldly expressions of life. And of course, we are part of the world. We are tired in the church because the world is tired. That's the cause of our tiredness. The difference between us and the world is the world continues in its path of unhappiness, thinking that things will actually balance things up, and we know they don't. Whereas within the church, if we let ourselves be overwhelmed by the false happiness of the world, which of course we can do because we're part of the world, we have to give that balance. We need to show that you can have within you a joy, a profound strength that isn't about walking around with a smile on your face. It's about a piece of knowledge. It's an interior awareness that there is something greater. So you can have joy in suffering. We don't equate happiness with suffering, but we can equate joy with suffering. So, you know, today, if we just look at the funeral of the Prince of Wales, of the, you know, Prince Philip, there was a joy that was being spoken of. Yet you could see the suffering of the family, and that, you know, and that's what happens. Joy is with us regardless. But if we think the answer to life is happiness, then we've got a problem. The message of the gospel is one of joy. And I think, David, you're absolutely right. Unless we are manifesting joy in our communities, we are following the secular, worldly agenda. We're not actually helping people to understand the joy of the gospel.
If I could throw a few thoughts in there. You're talking about the pandemic and, you know, our response to it. You know, Father John, I agree with you, joy, how important joy is, but I would say that the secular world is not tired. They're emboldened and they are energetic and they are ready to go to the streets. You just have to turn on TV and the world is not tired. It's we that are tired. You know, in many ways, you know, I think the pandemic exposed part of us as individuals in the church and communities within the church, are we maintenance or are we missionary? And I think when the pandemic came, if it was maintenance, then all the predictable parts of maintenance were thrown out the door. So I became paralyzed because I can't maintain in chaos. But if you were a missionary in nature, if your zeal was directed not towards maintenance but growing the church, the pandemic became an opportunity, because you saw that, oh, like, people are in distress. The world is, in a state of confusion and loneliness and separation. So how can I step into that and be missionary? During the pandemic, we've been in it for a year. I've been doing, I've been working full time in CCO for the last 32 years. I can say that the last year has been the most active and the most fruitful in the 32 years I've been in ministry. And how I would say is I've been more fruitful. What has made it possible for me to be more fruitful is that I took the opportunity to use the internet as a means by which to communicate. Now, the reason I say that is a lot of people say, I'm tired of being on Zoom. I want to get back to where we can do church, do our community in person. I'm tired. I don't want to do Zoom anymore. There's where suffering is. Being on Zoom is sharing in the suffering of Christ, meaning I'm willing to carry the cross of being on Zoom and how tiring Zoom is for the sake of the gospel. Paul had to kind of travel and shipwrecked and be beaten. I just have to put up with Zoom for a couple hours. But what orients me to Zoom and carry the burden of Zoom and being locked down is I want the message to go. I see as an opportunity for the message of the gospel to reach the ends of the earth. So in a way, I think the pandemic should have oriented us as a church to mission, not to maintenance. Anyway, my thoughts, they don't mean much, but anyway, there they are.
And what you were saying, Andre, about becoming missionary and also to use controversy or difficulty as an opportunity is really at the heart of what Catholic Voices does and has always been since Pope Benedict came to the UK. So it really made me think of that, using controversy as opportunity, using difficulty as opportunity. And so that's why Brendan's been doing these fantastic CV Connects and academies open to all. And we often preach about meeting people where they're at and then leading them to where God wants them to be. It's something we talk about in Catholic Voices so much. And like you say, Andre, using the internet, we are meeting people where they're at. They use their screens 8+ hours a day. I'd hate to confess to you what my screen time is on my phone right now, but it's probably around 5 or 6 hours, and then I use my laptop the rest of the time. So we're meeting people where they're at. They're already there. We're going into their homes now when we do these Zoom conferences, and we can talk about being tired, but people were tired of commuting. People were tired of having to go across London to get to the next event, and now it's meeting them exactly where they are without that. So we're always going to be tired of something, I think. But perhaps using whatever opportunity we have, whatever is out there, just grasping with two hands. And then, like David said, if we fail at it, we fail at it. But if we go at it faithful, if we go at it with joy, people will see that. People will respond to that. So we should have a lot of hope coming out of the pandemic from all that's been done in this time.
Yeah.
Could I suggest the better word than tired is weariness? I think there's a weariness, and I think that's quite different from tiredness. You can be doing amazing things and get tired, but weariness is a sort of a
well said,
And I think that within society, there's great efforts going into all sorts of things, and people get tired from doing it, but weariness is almost a sense that whatever you're doing, nothing seems to be coming to fruition. And I think you're right in terms of there is a vibrance in society insofar as people are trying to sort things out. But the question is that the particular path is a path that leads to weariness, where you have a sense that almost the we're seeing is despair. And there is so much despair in our world. And the way we connect with people, this is a very, very poor area. All of the poor people here, they don't have internet. They don't even have television. What they have is an open door of the church. The church door here is always open. It's open from 7 in the morning till 9 at night. And the people who come in essentially are the people who've got nowhere else to go. So while I agree that that all modern technology has an incredible opportunity for us, it must be seen in the presence of a bigger picture. That the need for, so at Walsingham, when we had the rededication, to our utter amazement, on that day, nearly 500,000 people connected. It was the biggest pilgrimage to Walsingham in its 1,000 years history. That 500,000 people made a choice to connect, to rededicate in that way. So obviously it's a powerful tool, but I think, so I'm saying two things. I'm saying there's a difference between weariness and tiredness, and I think that weariness is probably the more dangerous, but also to recognize that so many people do not have access to technology, and they need to see the physical presence, the face-to-face presence of the church, in whatever way, shape or form it comes.
A good opportunity to, something it makes me think of is Catholic Voices has been part of a survey that was taken across different Christian churches during the first pandemic, and we've had a second survey following up 7 or 8 months later. And some of the key things that were found, kind of interesting insights, was the difference between the general Catholic sensibility or response to the pandemic versus a kind of general Christian response. And this keys in with something that's being said in the chat, which is that for many Christians, there is this sense that the pandemic is a great opportunity and that church can quite easily move online. And so that therefore the pandemic as a whole has, the Holy Spirit is not contained by being in a building, that sort of approach. Whereas what this survey found for Catholics, and as we can only talk about British Catholics, but I would say is probably true universally, is this sense of the incarnationality, as Father John said, for not only for some for whom they don't have technology, but in the sense that the buildings matter. I think it can be quite trite to say, God doesn't need a building, but the buildings do represent something. There's a kind of incarnationality, as was spoken about right at the beginning, that it's where the most local community is an expression of that incarnation at the most local level. So one of the things I'm seeing, and actually the diocese where I'm living in, there's a very famous news story that people will no doubt have seen about the police stopping the Good Friday service. And the response of the local bishop was presence, to be present. So it wasn't a kind of, there were press statements and there were words spoken, but there was something about the way he responded, a kind of the presence. And I'm just really sensing that there has been this technological revolution that's happened within the church, but alongside that, there's this sense that we need to recover that and appreciate that incarnationality of the church and human relationships, like David was saying, that kind of, what are the things we've missed? We've missed those joyful moments that come from encounter, and keying in with a lot of what people have said. So I'm just thinking about this. There is a kind of tension between the kind of analog and digital ways that the church expresses itself. We've not got much time where we can really dive into that. What I'm thinking is, like, maybe as we get towards the end of this panel, there'll be some questions and thoughts, insights people might want to reflect. But perhaps if we start with David and go around, what is a kind of key takeaway when we think about the challenges and the opportunities? Like, what are you counseling people or counseling yourself? All the best preaching begins by preaching to oneself. what is your kind of takeaway that's kind of helping you to move not from the space of withdrawal, but to and the antidote to weariness? What is the antidote to weariness, and how do we help people to move forward in confidence to share the church's story? So perhaps if I begin with David, and we'll go around with some reflections.
Thanks, Brenden, and I'll try and be really brief. One of the things that's helping me, I hope this might help one or two other people, is that one of the things that's come to me in the last 12 months is a change in my relationship to interruption. And what I mean by that, if you look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, who said that some people consider their own strategies and their own planning to be so important, so critically important, that in actual fact, they begin to put their faith in their own plans. Now, if the pandemic has revived my sense of humour, it is that my diary emptied on the 21st of March last year, overnight. The world didn't collapse, right? People didn't hanker for more of David Wells. And one of the gifts of this was to discover not to take ourselves so seriously, for goodness sake. Right, plan, because planning makes things like today work. It wasn't for Catholic Voices and the planning that's gone into this wouldn't be happening. But actually, one of the things that I think has happened over the last 12 months is that God has reminded us that God didn't stop working in the pandemic. And that actually, I'm very mindful, I'll finish with this, Brenden, of a head teacher who I visited at about 4 p.m. on an afternoon last year, who said to me, I've got nothing done today. I've spent the whole day answering the phone and responding to people knocking on the door. And I walked away from that conversation and I thought, when did we get the idea that God is only working when we fulfill our plans? It may be that God said to the people who knocked on that door that day of that head teacher and who rang her up, look, we've got some tough times coming, but I've put a wonderful person in charge of the school and she's going to love you every time you phone her. And I thought to myself, do you know, what have we done? We've made ourselves the center of our own strategies, and then we provide plans, and then the plans don't work, so we alter them. And we've become somehow obsessed by strategy and performance. And it's depressing us, actually. The truth of the matter is, Luke chapter 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man in the ditch wasn't a plan, it was an interruption. And that's the test. So I'm going to try and learn out of all of this not to take myself too seriously.
And make room for the interruptions. I love it. Georgia, what's on your heart and mind as you think about going forward and helping people sharing the church's story?
I think what you said, Brenden, before about being present has been something that's really struck me throughout the that we were never made for isolation, and we know how damaging loneliness and isolation is for just us as human beings. So part of my role in the parish, I've even got a coffee fund now, because going for coffee with people and just listening to them, it changes their view of what the church is all about, because they don't have to sit and go sit through mass, which they don't understand straight away. They can just be heard. And I remember the first time I went through, say, a come and see Zoom call, what are your actual questions? They were so far away from what I thought that they were. The people who were asking questions about their own identity, asking questions about the church, because this is what the pandemic threw up for them. And actually their questions, they were just slightly different, and had we not been listening, we wouldn't have been able to answer those questions. So being present and listening, and not expecting us to be experts. So the principle that from Augustine that we use in Catholic Voices, we're just one beggar telling another beggar where we found the bread. That's it. So being present and having and assuming that level of relationality.
And I love the two insights from David and Georgia Keane so well, in a sense, and it's about the space we allow for others, and the space that, do we make space in our diary to be interrupted, and what that, what that effect that has, and going forward, how we're interrupted, how we make space for others. Yeah, really excellent. Andre.
It's really important you understand that I agree that the building is really important. But COVID has made the internet the only means by which we can do this stuff. At least in Canada, there's nobody knocking at the door at the parish because people can't go there. So this is the engagement. So I hope that when everything lifts, it'll be different. Then we go to the streets. But I have an extreme amount of hope for what we are about to embark upon. St. John Paul II talked about a missionary age coming upon the church. And I believe we're in that missionary age right now. Not a year ago, but right now. He also says that he saw a dawning of an era where people would be more open to the sowing of the gospel. I believe the grace of the moment for the church is that people will be open to the sowing of the gospel. So what I see in my imagination, in my prayer, is that as we kind of approach the fall of 2021, as COVID lifts, it's like springtime will come upon the earth, but also upon the church. And we want to be the ones that are out there bringing the message of the gospel, laying our lives down for the sake of those who have wandered away. Go whatever coffee shop we need to go to, and we'll speak to them in love, the message of the gospel clearly and simply, in a coffee shop, in our dinner table, wherever we can have a conversation, because I believe, and I'm very, very, very convinced that this is true, that the next 2 to 3 years is going to be a time of real grace for the church. The question is, are we willing to step into the springtime and to be willing to lay down our lives heroically for the sake of the kingdom?
Are we ready for this springtime of mission? I absolutely love it. Thank you very much. And finally, Father John, some kind of closing thoughts.
There is a famous sermon given by St. John Henry Newman at the restoration of the hierarchy in 1852 at Oscott College, our seminary, and it was called the Second Spring Sermon. The first spring, in effect, was Augustine coming to England, sent by Pope Gregory, and the second spring was the restoration of the church after the Reformation. I suppose the question that we, particularly in this country, are asked, but across the world, is what does a third spring look like? What does a third spring look like? And that each time where there is a spring in the church, new life in the church, in real terms, it's always one thing has brought it about. The renewal of the church is always brought about by holiness, by saints. So if you look at the history of the church, that's what we see. We see St. Francis, we see all these different saints, Philip Neri, in the midst of the sort of need for a spring in the life of the church. The church is always renewed by holiness. And if you look at the preface of Holy Men and Women, it says, "You renew the church in every age by raising up men and women, outstanding examples of your unfailing love." And surely that's what we're talking about. And it's not, there's, yes, at the moment, many places just can't reopen. That's not been our experience in England. within the Catholic community, we've opened, not every church, but most of them, we've been open most of the time. And it's been a fascinating experience actually being alongside people who are going through the most appalling situation at the moment. You know, we feed 500 people a week in our food bank. Most of these we've never seen before. Right? And they're coming and there's a relationship there. And so we are being presented with a whole range of things we've never seen before. Certainly we have tools that the church has never seen before in technology. But in the end, what we have all seen before, what brings about a true and real renewal and a new spring is holiness of life. And that holiness of life begins within each one of us. It's coming back to the Annunciation. It's what happened with Mary. She recognized that despite her fears and her anxiety, she could trust in God. And one of the great descriptions of the Annunciation was that Mary, St. Augustine said this, Mary conceived him in her heart before she conceived him in her womb. In other words, her faith was there already. There was a relationship she had with God. So before she did what needed to be done, i.e. to accept to be a mother, the mother of God, she had to accept her faith. She had to believe, because when the angel said to her, nothing is impossible for God, she then says, behold the handmaid of the Lord. So almost for our evangelization, we have to take, I'd say that simple phrase is a very powerful one, that we need to conceive him in our heart before we actually bring him into the world. Because by bringing him into our lives, that's how we bring him into the world. And a last quote from John Henry, at almost the last paragraph of the second spring sermon, he said, according to our, no, it's gone for a moment. Hang on, it will come to me in a minute. It's a wonderful, he's saying that according to our need, according to our suffering, so will God's grace be greater. Well, our suffering is great at the moment. The suffering of our people who do not know the word of God in their life is great. That's the reality. But the grace of God is there for us, rooted in our own lives. And that rootedness can be the way that desire for God in us can be shared with the desire for God. Possibly one of the key elements we might look at or think about is when Paul went to Greece and he walked around the temple and he said, what's that altar over there? What's that altar over there? And they said, it's the altar to the unknown God. In other words, it was a God that they were worshipping, but they didn't know his name. And Paul said to them, let me tell you his name. Let me tell you who he is. And our people worship all sorts of unknown gods, but they still have the desire for God. It may be just through material things, but possibly part of evangelization is there trying to help our people to understand who it is they're worshipping. The worship of the altar to the unknown God. How do we understand our people, help our people to see that? And Gregory, when he sent Augustine to England, said to him, don't destroy their temples, build on them, understand them, help them to realize that what they are worshipping will lead them to the true God, because worship is in the heart of every human being. Some of us worship strange things. As I will finish by Chesterton's great quote, when a man stops believing in God, it's not that he believes in nothing. When a man stops believing in God, he'll believe in anything. God bless our people. So many of them believe in anything these days. let us go to the altar of the unknown God, and let us help them to understand.
Amen. And that's rounded off things very, very nicely, actually. I love the reflections from people, to expect and allow for interruptions. How do we do that? Don't take ourselves too seriously. To leave and find space for being with others, whether it's by getting a coffee budget, but making sure that we have that space and time for incarnationality and presence, that we should be expectant for a springtime of mission for the church, that this is particularly a kairos moment as these restrictions lift. And we need, in order to prepare ourselves for that, to conceive him in our heart, to expect this third spring. I'm reminded of this quote from Pope Benedict: the church moves in every age due to holiness, not management. So how do we form ourselves in order to do that? The answer is, if you want to share the church story, be a saint. There you go, easy, job done. But how do we conceive him in our hearts? And yeah, very, very beautiful, and fits in with very much of the things that we reflect on in Catholic Voices, that, St. Paul at the Areopagus, and that even before that, he went into the markets to speak to people, kind of preparing himself. Where is the pulse of the culture? And so reading the signs of the times is going to be really important in the next moments, to be able to capitalize on all these insights that have been shared. So I just want to thank our panel for joining us, for sharing their insights, for sharing their wisdom.